right, welcome everyone. It's exciting to see you here. We've got a packed house and couldn't be more excited, so we're going to get right to it. My name is Francis Shen. I have the privilege of moderating tonight's event and welcoming you. I'm a law professor and also co-director of the Neurotech Justice Accelerator at NGM, which is one of the sponsors for tonight's event. I work at the intersection of neuroscience and law. And this event is meant to serve a couple of different functions. One is to talk about our substance, thinking about navigating stress and trauma, how that affects the brain and central nervous system, and how those effects may then play out in both the clinic and the courtroom. So there's some substance. But in addition, this is one of what we hope becomes a series and indeed a much larger project in which you can get involved, rooted here in Harvard and the affiliated hospitals and in Boston at the intersection of neuroscience and society. Neuroethics, neurolaw, but also educational neuroscience, neuroscience and music. So many ways in which neuroscience now plays a role or could play a role outside of the lab. So I invite you, we're going to go from 6 to 7 with the formal program, but we all plan to stick around and we would love to get to know a little bit more about you after that, especially if you want to get involved, because there are going to be a lot of ways to get involved. I want to start by saying thank you to our co-sponsors. I mentioned the Neurotech Justice Accelerator at NGM. Co-directors are Dr. Williamson, who will introduce in a second, and Dr. Gabriel Bostrom-Munoz. Shout out to postdoc Javier Mesa, who's right there, has helped us, as well as Danielle Andrade for getting today's program together. I want to thank the Harvard Brain Science Initiative, HBI. You might have met Adam or Parazad at the doors, and they have been instrumental, not just in making this event possible, but they are the umbrella organization for neuroscience and brain research across the university and affiliated hospitals. So thanks to both of them. And you can find out more about their events at brain.harvard.edu, including 2 things coming up in the next couple of weeks, one on pediatric brain cancer and the second on a bipolar disorder symposium. So brain.harvard.edu. I want to thank the Harvard Law School Petrie-Flom Center. Susanna Baruch is here, Executive Director, Laura Tron, who made this possible. They have been a fantastic partner for many years, and you should check their website out for future events, their event list. Sign up for their newsletter and read their blog, Bill of Health. Thanks to the Center for Law, Brain and Behavior, CLBB, and to MyLab for their help. And for those of you interested in careers in this area, neuroexcareers.org, the Dana Foundation Career Network, Neuroscience Society, and thank you to the Dana Foundation, which funds NGM and makes this possible as well. One last shout out, which would be to all of my colleagues, both here present and who planned with us. Nadine Gaub is here, others are here, Matt Baum, I think, is here, Insukyun. There is a small group, you should know this, of professors and students who are really interested in these areas. These events don't just show up, they're done through careful planning. I want to thank all of them and our other colleagues. With that out of the way, let me introduce our panelists for the evening and walk you through the event. We're going to start with a presentation from Dr. Nathaniel Harnett. He is the director of the Neurobiology of Affective and Traumatic Experiences Laboratory in McLean Hospital and an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. As we'll learn, he is a neuroscientist whose research is focused on understanding the brain basis for why some people are more likely to develop stress-related disorders such as PTSD and trauma, and we're going to hear his innovative research about the way that the environment and the things that we experience in daily life affect our brains, especially under stress and trauma conditions. We'll then hear from our panelists in response, thinking about what does this mean for the clinic and the courtroom. We'll hear first from Dr. David Silbersweig, who is the Stanley Cobb Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Chairman Emeritus of the Department of Psychiatry at Brigham and Women's Hospital. These bios go on and on, they're linked. I just want to flag a couple of things. He is both a neurologist and a psychiatrist, and is maybe the leader, I think, in trying to think about how do you use brain science and brain imaging in particular for understanding and treatment of psychiatric disorders. How I first wandered into your office many moons ago, trying to figure out who is doing this innovative research. It's David, and he's with us tonight to talk about that. We'll then hear from Dr. Teresa Williamson, who is the director for the Center for Minimally Invasive and Endoscopic Spinal Surgery and director for the Center for Innovative Neurotechnology for Neural Repair at Brown University, and also a member of Mass General Hospital's surgical team, and as I mentioned, co-director of the Neurotech Justice Accelerator. Dr. Williamson is the rare neurosurgeon who doesn't just operate, she also works in the realm of neuroethics and bioethics, specializing in spine disorders and brain spinal trauma in the clinic, and then specializing in questions around equity and surgery in her ethical work. It's a pleasure to have her tonight. And then finally, we will hear from Judge Nancy Gertner, who is senior lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, graduate of Yale Law School, and spent many years on the federal bench as a decorated federal district court judge. Has won many awards and has taught continues to teach the first law and neuroscience class right here at Harvard Law School. So an innovator in many different ways. Thank you, Judge Gertner, for being here as well. The bios are full bios you can link. I'm going to stop there. The last thing I will plug before I hand the slides over to Dr. Harnett is that another event upcoming in June is the Neurotech Justice Summit. You can go online and Google it, or we've got flyers all around. Another opportunity to continue conversations like this with more linked and more interactive, especially trainees in the room. I encourage you to check that out. With that, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Harnett to talk.
All right, so let me go ahead and modify this so that I can grip the podium like this for the next about 15 minutes. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank Dr. Shen for giving me this opportunity to talk to you guys a little bit. Like I said, I got about 15 minutes, so for some of this stuff, I'm going to be giving a brief overview of something that my lab thinks about a lot, which is what is it we actually know about the impacts of trauma on the brain, and how are those impacts moderated, or how are they affected by the societies in which we live? How do the environments that we inhabit affect how we respond to stressors in our daily lives? Just very briefly, I think I have to say this, I don't have any financial conflicts of interest. I forgot to put on the slide. If anyone does have financial conflicts of interest that they want to help me get, please diversify. All right, no, we're being serious now. So let's talk about trauma. We've all had a laugh, now we talk about something serious. So when I say the word trauma, I think a lot of people have an idea in their head sort of colloquially about what we're really talking about. In the psychiatric space, the definition of trauma is both very broad and surprisingly narrow. We might talk about things like exposure to war, serving in the military as being a traumatic event, things like natural disasters, fires or floods, tornadoes or hurricanes, assaultive experiences that are sexual and non-sexual in nature, and even things like car accidents or learning of the death of a loved one or family member are all things that can be considered traumatic in the psychiatric definition. When we think about what we call the criterion of a traumatic event in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we're really talking about things that involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence that either A, directly happened to you, B, witnessed the event happening in person, C, you learned of the trauma happening to a close family member or friend, or 4, you're exposed to a sort of repeated extreme details of the adverse event, such as in the case of first responders. When I talk about all the different ways that you can be exposed to trauma through all the different modalities, it's probably not going to surprise you if I say that trauma exposure is really common in the United States. I think the lowest prevalence we have is about 55% of people who experience at least one DSM-5 criterion traumatic event. About 90% is more likely the actual estimate of people who experience it. It's associated with a number of adverse post-traumatic outcomes, things like post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD that people have heard about. Trauma is also what we call transdiagnostic, so it's associated, or it's a risk factor for many other types of things, including high blood pressure, diabetes, as well as recidivism and justice involvement. And so it's really important to start to understand what are the impacts of trauma on the brain and on society, and how do we sort of understand who we can target our resources to help mitigate some of those deleterious outcomes. In the neuroscience space, we've got a pretty good idea of what the major brain regions are that are involved in how people process traumatic events. And we really think that that circuit is centered on the amygdala, shown down there in blue, the hippocampus, shown in red, and different components of the prefrontal cortex, shown in green, purple, and yellow. The amygdala is a site that's really important for learning fear in our environment, for associating cues that predict that something bad is going to happen. The hippocampus, in contrast, is really important for what we call declarative memory processes. It's important for understanding the context in which those stressors occur. So for example, if I'm sitting on the couch watching Animal Planet and I hear the hiss of a snake, that's probably a really safe environment. But if I encounter that same hiss out in the woods, that's a potentially dangerous environment. And the hippocampus is really important for helping me understand what context I'm actually currently in. And then these different components of the prefrontal cortex help to modulate hippocampal and amygdala activity by supporting selective attention processes, working memory processes, even direct regulation of those specific brain regions through reciprocal connections. Really the important point of this slide is that we kind of have an idea what the brain regions are that support trauma processing. When I said that the definition of trauma is both very broad and very narrow, the reason I say it is because 90% of people experience trauma. There's a lot of different ways to experience it, but we're often talking about discrete events that people experience. And the way we typically think about PTSD and how people get it is people are nominally healthy, they experience this trauma, and then they go on to develop PTSD. But the reality is that there are many other things that stress people out that happen around that traumatic event. We might think of post-traumatic factors like you're in a car accident and now you have to figure out insurance, you have to figure out if you can go to work anymore. Those are things that add stress and modify your responses. We might think about paratraumatic factors if you were driving particular parts of Boston, maybe that stressed you out. Or pre-traumatic factors like childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences that might modify how you're approaching the traumatic event to begin with. I think all these are really important and we can talk about all these at a different time, but what I want to focus on is something a little bit different, which is the actual environment in which these traumas occur, and the understanding that the environments in which they occur are not random. We live in built environments that have been specifically structured and have specific interests on us. Normally I have to say this, but I think everyone here understands that that's Boston, so it'll be a little bit of a Boston-specific talk. If you do this in other audiences, they don't actually know what the city is, which is not surprising. So we can think about many different aspects of the environment that might impact the brain and impact behavior. A couple ones that we've studied in our lab are neighborhood disadvantage and green space. Neighborhood disadvantage really just refers to the sort of general availability of resources within different neighborhoods. So for example, you can look at a place like Baltimore, which has a good mix of areas that are low disadvantage in blue and high disadvantage in red. And you compare that to where a lot of us in neuroscience get our NIH grants, which is Bethesda, which is very high advantage. It's an important thing that we can think about in terms of what's actually getting funded. We can also think about things like green space, which is really just the availability of trees and other greenery within the neighborhoods that people live in. And when we've done this research, we've looked at individuals who have recently experienced a traumatic event. We've followed them for a period of a year, we've done brain imaging on them, and we've looked to see what their trajectories of post-traumatic symptoms are. How does their levels of PTSD essentially change over time? Now on the left, what I'm showing you is that if you look at where people are living at the time of their traumatic event, that's directly associated with what we might call a multimodal outcome in terms of brain imaging. Right within the prefrontal cortex, how much you respond to negative stimuli, how the prefrontal cortex is interconnected with itself, both in terms of underlying gray matter, which refers to neurons, and white matter, which are the sort of structural connections between them, are all associated with this sort of aspect of disadvantage. The other thing that we've looked at is how green space impacts your likelihood to stay resilient after experiencing that traumatic event. By resilient, we mean not really showing any PTSD symptoms. And one of the things we found is that if you live in an area of high green space, and you have a general idea that you're pretty resilient yourself after a traumatic event, you feel like you have some internal resources to deal with, living in higher green space areas is associated with better outcomes after the traumatic event. Surprisingly, if you live in an area or if you feel yourself that you don't have good internal resources, green space might not be as protective as you think, and that's something we can talk about later, that's more of a detail. The important thing is that these aspects of where people are living at the time of their traumatic event is impacted both in terms, or showing up rather, both in terms of their brain biology and how they're actually recovering after that traumatic event. The other important thing about the environments, built or otherwise, that we're talking about is that these social contexts are not really random, they're really racialized. And so I think some people know this, but Boston, like every other major city in America, has this very storied history of redlining. You can look at maps that basically grade whether or not people were getting home loans first, second, third, fourth, by really the presence of black people living in those neighborhoods. You can do sophisticated analyses with indices we have now, like the Childhood Opportunity Index, which really just indexes the amount of economic benefits, school benefits, health benefits that are available to kids. And if you overlay that sort of map where darker is a higher Childhood Opportunity Index, lighter is lower, you really see that these same neighborhoods that show the strongest effect of redlining also have the lowest childhood opportunity index. Another semi-fun thing you can do is you can look at premature death rates by where people get off on the T. This was a study done several years ago. We all know the T, very wonderful. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you look at the highest rates of premature death, areas like Maverick, Dudley Square, and Mattapan have the highest rates. And if you overlay the racial and ethnic demographics of Boston about 10 years ago, you see that areas like Maverick, Dudley Square, and Mattapan largely minoritized. And so part of what we have to understand when we're talking about the ways in which environment might impact the brain behavior is that there are storied histories of racialization that may have sort of these long-term outcomes that we want to understand. It's really hard to do this if you're just focusing on, say, neighborhood disadvantage or green space, because you lack that sort of understanding of the storied history of those neighborhoods. So part of what we've been trying to do in the lab is understand if we can look at what are the disproportionate burdens that certain groups are facing, and how might that show up both in terms of brain biology and PTSD symptoms. So we've been doing analyses with what's called the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. It's this huge study of about 12,000 kids from across the country. And we've looked at how different aspects of neighborhood disadvantage, income, general sort of adverse experiences relate to black and white brain differences or black and white brain variability that's attributable to these sort of disproportionate burdens. And one of the things I always like to start out with is that while we can look at these regions like the prefrontal cortex, like the amygdala, like the hippocampus, and we will see differences between the groups, at the raw level, these are very small differences about 9 to 10 years old. So as these individuals are relatively young, the differences start to emerge, but they're relatively small. And one of the things that we can show is that if you actually statistically account for the fact that these individuals are growing up in different neighborhoods with different pressures, with different adversity, you can actually mediate a huge percentage of those race-related differences. To put that another way, if you live in an under-resourced community, you have sort of worse brain developmental outcomes, particularly in these brain regions that we know are important for PTSD and trauma and other health-related outcomes. We've looked at certain individuals both as they're adults as well. So we have individuals from kids, we also have individuals from adults. And part of what we want to understand is, are there sort of cumulative burdens that build up over time? It's one thing to do a sort of cross-sectional analysis. We say, okay, at 9 to 10 years old, there's this effect. What we really want to know is, as people continue to live in these neighborhoods, is there sort of growing burden and accelerated factors over time that might impact that brain development? It's hard to do that with those same kids right now, because I think they're like maybe 17 or 18. We only just got that data to be able to look at. We have alternative data from a cohort in Birmingham, Alabama, which I, again, don't think I have to tell you, has another sort of history of redlining, where areas that are now sort of the highest disadvantage are also the most likely to be black in those neighborhoods. And even if you look at our own samples, you can really see that black individuals in our samples show higher rates of violence exposure, lower family income, and greater neighborhood disadvantage. There's really clear sort of residential segregation that shows up in the data that we collect as well. And just like this prior finding, if we actually look at how individuals respond to, in this case, what we might call an aversive threat, we just put them in a scanner, we sort of stress them out a little bit, how do their brains respond, we really see there's these strong race-related differences across the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus, where we're seeing blunted reactivity to stress among these black individuals compared to white individuals. And again, if we actually account for the fact that these individuals are not growing up in the same neighborhoods, that they're experiencing different pressures between them, we actually show that a lot of those differences just completely go away. And so again, it's not that there's some like intrinsic race-related difference, it's really a way to highlight that the cumulative burden of these under-resourced communities have very clear neurobiological and physiological representations when we actually do these studies in brain regions that we know are important for trauma and PTSD. The last sort of thing that I want to highlight is, and I don't know why that's cut off, I'm sorry it's cut off on your screen, is that my colleagues have been doing a lot of work. So I've talked a little bit now about sort of like the structure of neighborhoods, and they're getting a little bit more in these same sort of individuals and what's happening at the interpersonal level. So we know these individuals are living in under-resourced communities, there's a lot of stress and a lot of trauma. What is the sort of impact of individual experiences? So they've been looking at racial discrimination and how that impacts these same brain regions. Part of what they do, I'm not going to be able to show you, and that's good because I can never remember the name. They're doing something called an effective street test. The name doesn't really matter. It's a way of trying to look at how well you perform when there's distracting information. So how well, for example, are you able to give a talk and stay on task when half of your slides aren't showing up? That's basically what they're And what they're able to show is that individuals who have greater experiences or more frequent experiences of racial discrimination are actually doing a lot better on that task. You can tell how much racial discrimination I've experienced. One of the things they're able to show is that that sort of effect is related to activity in what we call the ventral neurofrontal cortex. It's a brain region that's really important for emotion regulation, sort of clamping down on emotional responses. And so individuals who have these more frequent experiences of discrimination are doing better at regulating themselves, and then they therefore do better on the task. Which, if you really think about it, makes a lot of sense. If you've been through a lot of stressful things in your life, you haven't quite hit that threshold where it's gotten to too much, and you're able to come into a research study, you get really good at ignoring distracting information so that you can do the things that you need to do. What I think that both my colleagues in our findings here, Carter at Emory and Georgia State, would say is that that comes at a very clear cost. So they've also looked at other aspects of neurobiology, like white matter, and what they've shown is that racial discrimination actually sort of impugns that white matter. These structural connections between different brain regions are actually deteriorating, or at least we would say they're deteriorating, related to racial discrimination. And that's then contributing to downstream health problems like cardiovascular disease and diabetes in these same individuals. And so although there are aspects of experiencing stress that can be beneficial in terms of adaptive functioning, that stress still has to go somewhere. And so part of what I'm really trying to show you is that there are these multi-level effects of stress on the brain and on the body that we know are related to PTSD and know we are related to downstream health outcomes. And to sort of wrap this up, so I think I'll get out done just on time. To sort of wrap up the broader implications and maybe gives us something to sort of talk about either for the panel or for the larger Q&A, I think part of what we have to understand when it comes to neuroscience and trauma and society is that our societal structures really do shape part of how our brains and bodies respond to these different traumas that we experience, and they shape our outcomes to them. They're intricately related to how these sort of prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala regions respond and develop over time. We also have to acknowledge that our societal structures are not random. Dorchester isn't the way it is just purely randomly. Roxbury isn't the way it is purely randomly. Back Bay is not the way it is purely randomly. There are certain historical pressures that have shaped these neighborhoods, and we have to be aware of that as we think about the sort of long-term impacts. And again, I want to be very clear. I'm not making an essentialist or deterministic statement here. There's a lot of variability in the data, and I think when we think about how brain imaging interconnects with society, I think a lot of people want to say that, oh, we found this brain pattern and that means people will do this. That's not what we're saying. There's a lot of things that we need to consider, but it does indicate a trend, and it does indicate an aspect of our society that we need to be aware of as we're sort of moving forward. So with that, I think I ended just on time, so I'll thank you guys.
Thank you for organizing, as always, such a stimulating and important and timely and timeless discussion. It's timeless because, as you've heard in an incredible talk by Nate, these are evolutionarily conserved systems in our brain. And you may have heard about the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain and this and that. And our brain is actually lobes locked upon top of lobes through different eras and environments in evolution. And it's adaptive, in fact, really important for survival to be able to perceive and evaluate and react to stress when it's appropriate. And we have these built-in systems, as you heard, that are ancient and that are really important. And now they're hooked up to these other higher order systems, including higher order cortex and rational and control and monitoring areas of the brain. And in humans, in us, what we see in health and in disease is a confluence of all of those eras of evolution working together or sometimes not working so well together. And what Nate has described is that threats are not just a lion running after us, but they're social as well, and they are environmental, and we all have risk and resilience factors. And as you heard, Nate was presenting a nuanced formulation in which environment and context is one part of it and a really important part of the variance. And then there's also biological parts, but not necessarily biology by the group that you're in or whatever, but biology with regard to the throw of the dice of your parents' DNA that you happen to inherit. And we know that there are genes and functional polymorphisms in the brain that mediate the degree to which a person, two people who are equally exposed to the same threat at the same time, will have a reaction that will be more excessive, more dysfunctional versus more adaptive and more resilient. And so it's this dance really between nature and nurture, it's not one anymore, and development, as we heard, and the time at which these things occur, which is very important. Abuse and neglect, which often can cross all strata of society at certain points in a person's childhood, can reset the system in ways that, as we heard, are conducive, unfortunately, to a lot of mental health and physical health issues later in life. So being able to understand the connections, being able, as Nate and others are doing, to study them rigorously is something that, as this evening suggests, is really important for people who are interested in law, in society, in ethics, and in sociology, or even, I would say, anthropology, which gets to another issue, is that different cultures have different ways of addressing things, and also have different resilience factors. There's some interesting studies that were done by Dennis Charney and colleagues years ago that looked at a whole bunch of different people in different settings and different cultures, in the military, before, during, and after exposure to trauma, importantly, so that you had people as their own control. And they took a whole bunch of psychological, social, biological measures and were able to ascertain important risk and resilience factors and profiles that would even predict, to a certain extent of fidelity, the degree to which a person, when exposed to a trauma, would be vulnerable. And as physician scientists, what we want to do is understand that vulnerability and cut it off at the pass. So prevention is really better than treating, right? Once the horse is out of the barn. So we want to be able to understand, and now with brain imaging and with other science, we're able to predict who may be more vulnerable and institute mechanisms of, hopefully, degrees of protection. And for those of you who are interested in education in the ed school, there's a whole bunch that can be done and needs to be done. For those of us who are trying to address policy, if you bring data like this to lawmakers and say, look, it's, regardless of where you are on some political spectrum or belief system, this is the evidence, and it can be hopefully compelling. And so that's just part of why this work is important. The protective factors are just as important as the risk factors, and teaching people mechanisms of resilience is something that beforehand is important. Also, there are certain pharmacologic and biologic ways, once a person's been exposed to a trauma, that the possibility, or at least this is a very active area of research right now, with us and others, to try to cut things off at the pass, so that when I went to med school, I was taught that memories were fixed, just like a photograph, and your brain took them out, and that's how it is. And we know now that memory, and from legal things, that memories are mutable and suggestible and a whole bunch of other things beyond a person's control, consciously and unconsciously. But among the things that happens biologically in the brain is that when we bring up a memory, it's labile and it's not fixed for the rest of our life. And that can be for good or for ill. In the case of PTSD, it means that the memory gets glommed onto a strong negative emotion and set of autonomic reactions and anxiety reactions that then cause a lot of problems. But now the neurobiology of that process, which we call reconsolidation of a memory, is being taken apart on the molecular and cellular and physiologic level. And there are some trials and interventions after a person's experienced a trauma to try to strip that memory of its negative emotional autonomic valence. But still, you don't want to erase the memory semantically or episodically. And those are some things. The sorts of circuits that you heard from Nate are now amenable to cognitive behavioral therapy. That's actually evidence-based for PTSD, and we've been involved in trials of that. And I could show you a picture of the brain in cognitive behavioral therapy, a talk therapy that builds skills and awareness and control, that it's actually a brain modulation treatment. We see the prefrontal cortex exerting more top-down control and modulation of the overactive limbic threat systems that Nate described. There are pharmacologic approaches, whether that's a beta blocker to decrease autonomic sympathetic tone, or whether it's an SSRI that can be helpful at the level of the bottom-up circuitry that Nate was alluding to. Or we also have the ways to block reconsolidation and also brain stimulation now. We're involved in a trial at the Brigham of transcranial magnetic stimulation on the surface of the brain to modulate this circuitry to try to be beneficial. So I'll wrap up my comments by just underscoring the implications of what Nate beautifully described, focusing on mechanisms of risk and resilience and trying to tip that balance. I was fortunate to be a co-PI with Bruce McEwen and Joe Ledoux, who were very prominent basic neuroscientists in fear and anxiety and stress when I was back in New York for 10 years. And Bruce coined or really promoted this term of allostasis, which is the degree to which, just like homeostasis, that we need to regulate ourselves as organisms or societies, that our brain has a certain amount of built-in plasticity, and the thermostat can regulate itself so much, but for any given thermostat, if the risk is greater, if your risk factors are greater, and or if the threat is severe enough and or chronic enough and you're vulnerable, it tips you over to where it can't get back into the thermostat mode anymore. And so it's the biology now of the thermostat that we're trying to understand above and beyond the biology of the threat mechanisms themselves. I'll zoom out to finish, if that's okay, to just say that one of the things I'm very interested in these days is how this threat circuitry gets manipulated by demagogues and propaganda and AI and bots, and elicits fear in people and induces brain reactions of us versus them that cause conflict in the world. And some of my biggest interests that Francis and I talk about a lot, maybe we'll talk about at another event, is how you then scale up from what Nate is talking about to intergroup conflict, which unfortunately we see all over the world, and try to understand how these systems are fueling it and what it is that we may be able to do as a society with many of the fields that you're all in, if we work together to try to address it. So thanks.
Thanks so much. That was excellent and an amazing talk. Although I don't only just operate, I did do 3 surgeries today, so my brain is still a little bit, I'm coming back. But I think, I have also 3 sort of unrelated, they're each unrelated to each other points to make. I think the first one is surrounding the brain's response to neurotrauma. And so just some interesting things, you showed that slide about trauma, and when we look in particularly racial, when we group by race and look at response to trauma, we know a lot of things. We know that Black and brown brains will not recover at the same rate. We know that patients are going to be more likely to rely on feeding tubes, more likely to need help at home after these types of traumas. And so we take that context and then we take another step back to like if we make the environment then the hospital, right? So what are we doing in the hospital for these patients who may have experienced repeated traumas related to this type of event? So usually, you would hope that a brain trauma or something like that is, this is your first and only experience with this as a family, but often we were actually seeing patients who had had multiple family members who are involved in these types of traumas. And one of the things we found is that patients of color were particularly more likely to pursue invasive procedures, even when there potentially wasn't a good opportunity for recovery. But when they got those procedures, they were still doing not as well. And so there's sort of this paradoxical, like, what is the quality of life or outcome that we want? And so we went and we looked at, like, what are we doing as a system in terms of prognostication? What are we doing in terms of how we help people decide whether or not their loved one may or may not have a good recovery? And what we found is that physicians actually, in some standardized scenarios that we gave them, were prognosticating, oh yeah, they're anywhere from like 5 in 100 to 99 in 100 to survive this injury. It was the same injury. And so when we see this, like, and this was, by the way, with an average amount of experience of 13 years. So anytime a neurosurgeon tells you they're God, they're not, they don't know. And so, I think looking at that level of variability, we really leave ourselves vulnerable, especially knowing that there's a variable response to trauma, and we have the possibility of perpetuating these traumas. So there was some work that I did looking at actually like families that would constantly lean to me or other providers of color because they had a different level of trust after these types of injuries. And so I think, understanding really well how to communicate at the face of trauma, that's, a big part of my daily job, how to communicate at the face of trauma and how to blend in the cultural background and the experiences with the healthcare system can literally make life or death differences that can propagate, throughout generations. And so I think your point about what are the protective things we can do is a really interesting one. And I think kind of leading to my second point, one of the things I hope for our system as we try to change some of these problems is I think one of the first places that I had to fight my brain from going when you put your map up about the green spaces, right, was like plant more trees in Roxbury, right? Like then we'll fix the whole problem, And I think the reality is, playing on the community's built-in strengths, like figuring out, in that bi-directional neuroscience fashion of let's get in the community and see where the strength is related to, resilience. Maybe it isn't necessarily at, a park, or maybe that park's not available, but maybe it is like a cookout and like all you need is a grill, or all you need is, a church space or whatever it may be. I think there's a lot of strength in a lot of communities of color that sometimes the rhetoric we end up, propagating is one that doesn't celebrate or embrace that strength as a part of treatment and healing. And so I think there's just a really interesting movie that came out, or documentary that actually, other plug, in April we'll have an event at More Than Words, screening a movie called Black Longevity that, like, I don't know if anyone knows, like, that the oldest woman alive is a Black woman. She's 115. And actually the previous oldest woman alive in the U.S. was also a Black woman, was 115. And so it's not the type of, story or thing that you hear a lot, but when they followed their lives, it was a lot around community, a lot around purpose, a lot around joy, a lot around being around grandkids, right? And so how do we foster those types of community responses in order to better improve some of these trauma relationships? And then the last piece, I told you these are all unrelated. The last piece is that, I think a lot about physicians and physicians of color who are the most likely to do this type of work. So like when it comes to equity-based healthcare work, you're much more likely to get someone who's from a minority community doing this type of work. It's just the data. There was a recent study that came out in JAMA Surgery that showed physicians, or surgeons specifically, die like 5 years younger than their sort of matched counterparts. Women surgeons die even earlier, and black surgeons die even earlier. So like, bye. No. Sorry, neurosurgeon humor. My bad. But I think, when we think about like this idea of weathering and what you showed with the white matter, like repeated experiences of trauma in a system that is not built for you, I just think about like as we recruit and bring all of you in and we're like, hey, come do this work, carry this flag, and we maybe, how we can go about and some of the things that we're doing at NGM, like matching people with coaches, having peer support, having community events, like all very purposeful at like, let's try to integrate a different response during these traumatic events potentially.
I feel like I want to give you a Tylenol or something. My presentation is at such a disconnect from everyone's because the law is disconnected from all of this. Just a personal note. This work is so important, particularly at a time that we are trivializing race discrimination. We are trivializing it in a way that we had never seen before. And so showing its grounding in the brain and its impact on the brain is really, really critical. The law is so disconnected from all of this. It was only, in order to collect damages if you are beaten up in prison, you have to show that you were physically injured, because the law didn't count emotional injury. And partly it didn't count emotional injury because of the notion that people would, particularly prisoners, would fake it. And so in fact, all of the data that we just saw is really irrelevant to proving real trauma. I focus in my work, particularly since I left the bench, on the men that I sentenced and who they are and what their communities were like, and information that I didn't have when I was a judge and that I've learned about now. And so one bit of information, when you look at, there's a pre-sentence report that every judge gets before you sentence someone on the federal side. And when I looked through the pre-sentence reports, there was a section that said physical injury. And almost every one, drug offenders, had physical injuries, suggesting they were either victims of violence, oftentimes perpetrators of violence, or witnesses of violence. And of course, this didn't figure into the sentencing calculus at all. And partly because, this is an interesting problem, it was ubiquitous. Sentencing is individualizing, and when in fact it adheres in the whole system, how do you address that? So I learned about the extent to which they were all, as I said, victim witnesses or perpetrators of violence, and oftentimes they were the same person. In other words, a person who was a victim or a witness wound up as a perpetrator. In addition, whole communities were swept up in the war on drugs, have been for the past 40 years, and those communities completely map on the communities you're talking about. And so what do we do about that? If they've mapped onto that, it's almost like the very ubiquity of these kinds of conditions make it impossible for the law, for individual judges to deal with it. How do we deal with it? We have to be dealing with it as a policy matter. We have to be dealing with it as a general matter, because there really were no, I couldn't quantify the degrees of trauma in the individuals that I saw. The neuroscience sadly doesn't allow us to individualize, but you couldn't really individualize the degrees of trauma that we saw. All the individuals that I've been studying came from one particular neighborhood and one particular school which had lost its accreditation years before. There were no water fountains, there were no social workers, there were no counselors. How does that figure? I oftentimes talk about sentencing in my classes, that I'm the caboose of the system. Everything has happened long before us, and how does a judge deal with that? The answer is it has to be dealt with systemically and has to be dealt with at an earlier point. Then there's prison. It is, the Center for Law, Brain and Behavior has focused on solitary confinement, which really, up until recently, was not considered an Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment. up until recently, the cases have begun to say that this is clearly cruel and unusual, and part of it was, I'm not suggesting that we were responsible for this, but we have filed briefs suggesting that in fact solitary confinement is not just uncomfortable and makes you upset, but changes the brain. And changes the brain in the way people are describing. Because again, the mind-body division in the law made it impossible to show that there were real differences, and these were differences that were affecting the impulsivity of the prisoner, affecting the ability to learn, affecting all the things that we care about when they leave prison. So solitary confinement was an issue. Looking at the impact of prison, qua prison, not even solitary confinement, but being distance from your family and your community leads to shorter life expectancy. In other words, just the fact of imprisonment leads to lower life expectancy. So how do you begin to deal with that? How do you begin to deal with prisons that are in fact organized according to the very communities that individuals came from? How do we begin to take the insights of this panel and actually apply it to what we do every day? And how do we deal with what is quintessentially the trauma of the prison, not just even with respect to solitary confinement. Ordinary prison is like that. And as we talked, I thought, even apart from what I specialize in, which is sentencing and imprisonment, which is really so much fun. I just want to, when I think about it. But also even how the system repays damages. The neuroscience can speak to the ways in which we compensate people for the injuries. So far, it has not done that a great deal. I mean, we talk about damages as, what emotional distress was. Well, emotional distress pales before the kind of concrete injuries that the panel has been talking about, and how you begin to address that. Again, there's a problem with respect to neuroscience individualizing, but nevertheless, we will get past that one day. So there are sort of policy questions. And then finally, the other policy question that we deal with is the whole question of the application of the law to adolescence. The application of the law to adolescence and the neurodevelopment of adolescence, and what an incredible disconnect there is between the way the system deals with adolescents, particularly adolescents from these communities. So there, as I said at the beginning, there's a fundamental disconnect between all the observations that are coming out of the panel and then what happens when I cross the street and go to court. There's a disconnect in terms of the laws that we apply that doesn't reflect any of this. There's a disconnect in terms of what judges know and take into account, both in individual cases and in sentencing. And so while the audience here and the advances that we hear about has to begin to bleed over into legal policy and has to bleed over into the courtroom, is doing so slowly. But for the lawyers in the room, it has to do so at a bigger and it's much more substantial pace, because it's not an abstraction. The kind of damages that we have been talking about are not an abstraction. It's not just I feel bad because I was in solitary confinement. It is solitary confinement transformed me. The trauma of prison transformed me. Probation and parole that doesn't address trauma is probation and parole that is just a ceremony of a tripwire to see whether or not you will be sent back to prison. So I have the least optimistic things to say on this panel, although I wish you all well.
And with that, we'll open up. We've got 10 minutes, so if you have short questions and short responses, we can get to a few questions, and then as I said, we're going to stick around afterwards to mingle. Okay, trainee, we're going to trainees. Here we go. Right here. So tell us your name, like where you're coming from, what your background is, your student, where you're studying.
I'm Hanan. I'm a PhD student in neuroscience, but just first year. I was curious about the presentation, a question where relying on neuroplasticity. So the brain is said to be very plastic and it can adapt to the environment it is in. So do you think once they are, first of all, does the developmental age of the child matter in this case? Because if they are in this under-resourced community and then they go back to a community where there are a lot of resources and they are happier in that environment, do you think the brain adapts because of the neuroplasticity?
Yeah, I mean, I think to give a very sort of route answer, I think that the environment that you're in has a very pronounced effect on your development. I think part of what you're asking is if you live in a bad environment early on in development and then you go to a good environment later on, how does that impact you? And I think that there are several studies that have looked at that sort of thing. And in general, going from a bad environment to a good environment, having upward economic mobility is also associated with better outcomes. And that's the type of thing that we want to see essentially for everyone, even individuals that so far haven't been able to get those good environments. So ultimately, I think there's a lot more to the answer, but like the real answer is, yeah, I think the brain is really plastic. I think it's a lot more plastic than many of us probably give it credit for in a lot of ways. And there's definitely a chance for behavioral change.
Okay. Go right here up front. Tell us who you are and background.
My name's Ari. I wasn't good in school, but I'm a fan. No. So I have more of like a quick large scale question. I've been lucky enough to travel and experience different cultures. And we mentioned like the mammalian reptilian brain. You know, we have evolved in communities. Like we evolved in like deep communities, like hyper connected to other people consistently all the time. And I'm curious of like anybody's opinion of like, we're very individualistic and we're very separated. I don't know if we've ever been more separated from one another than right now. And to what extent do we think just that one like topic relates to this?
I can say something brief and then perhaps me. You're absolutely right, and I alluded to that. We're social animals. We grew up throughout prehistory in tribes, essentially, and social exclusion actually itself is a trauma, which is very interesting and really important when one considers, how we get along in communities, on campuses, etc. The ability to, so right now between social media as well as in more Western societies, the more individualistic rather than the communal approach to personhood. These are things that are very important, and right now I'm mentoring a PhD student in anthropology who's studying this and is going to be going to Fiji and then comparing to Boston and so forth, about whether the dissociation between the environment that we evolved in socially and the environment that we're in socially right now in different places or not affects these. So there's studies going on to look at these sort of things.
We'll do one question. It might be the last one.
Thank you. This was just a fascinating program, the way you're integrating from so many different directions. My question relates to the downstream impacts you're describing, all the way from child development through the prison experience. And I can't help but wonder how much inadequate or disrupted sleep is involved with this. And I'm in the division of sleep medicine at the medical school, so that's part of my perspective. But are we looking at that?
That was one of the issues that we dealt with in the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior brief on solitary confinement. Because one of the ways in which you torture people in solitary confinement is keep them and one of the, again, the presentation was not just that this is terrible, and it is terrible, but also that it is completely dysfunctional, so that the person who emerges from this is less functional than you want that person to be, which doesn't make sense by any theory of punishment. But sleep is part of that.
Sure, even in terms of the green space issue, when buildings are tight together and it's an environment full of noise, kids are not sleeping. They're waking up. They're failing at school because they're not inadequately rested. So it's not just because there are trees. It's because it's literally changing the way the environment imposes on the brain.
And as you may know from your work, sleep is where memory consolidation occurs.
Exactly.
And important aspects of the brain cleansing itself, literally and figuratively, it occurs, and restoring itself. So these are vital.
I'd just add that tying together the environmental aspect with sleep, with some of these neighborhood effects, our partner at the Dana Center, the other foundation is at UCLA and CDU, and they did this really interesting study of helicopter noise, and this is actually a really great story because it's where like neuroscience really impacted policy, and so they went and did a collab with the community, said of South LA, what's the biggest disruptor, and I think they thought they were going to hear all kinds of things, and they heard helicopters, right? And they looked at the patrols, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and 4, and then kids are supposed to be at school at 7 a.m. And so they actually showed the impact on anxiety, the impact on sleep, the impact on school performance, and then they were able to take it to the city and actually cut their routes and show that there's not a change, necessarily in the safety and policing patterns.
Francis, may I say one thing with regard to Lisa Kutchgerger's comment that I think may be relevant for the audience here, which is that we now are in an era where we can look at individual functional profiles of brain activity in the brain. And I think that will bridge the gap. We're still a long way, and I get asked not infrequently to be an expert witness for someone who did some crime and there's a brain finding. I refuse, actually, because I think the science is not there largely, although in certain cases it absolutely is. And I think but that opens a whole other can of worms, frankly.
Yes.
But we are getting to the point where we can study individuals as well.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege to ask the last question to our panel. There are a lot of folks in here whose careers are ahead of them. If they get excited about this, but maybe also concerned, and they're asking me, what can I do? What should I be studying? Where's the next thing? I'm wondering if each of our panelists could describe from their field recommendations for questions to ask, places to go, whether they're resources. I'll make one plug at the end, but maybe we can end on that, looking forward to your recommendations. And I'll remind everyone, we're going to stick around afterwards to hang for a little bit, but I'd invite our panelists on that.
Oh, you're all going to make me go first. So that's a great ending question because it's super difficult. So, I feel like I get this question once in a while, and I think that my general response in terms of like what you should seek out, what you should do, is you should read everything. Like you really should sort of let your mind explore and be creative in that way. I think that a lot of the ways that I got into this field are not by thinking I want to know like what the impact is on certain communities. It was I want to know about PTSD. I want to know like why people are getting traumatized and like what the heck's going on up there. And if you allow that sort of open-endedness to your questions, it allows you to go in a lot of different ways. And that led to a lot of reading about the racial justice literature, the racial health literature. What do we actually know about these things? Then you find out you don't know all that much, and that gives you a new avenue to explore. So I think, like for me, it's a bad answer maybe, but I think just be open to everything. Just be willing to explore and learn and reach out to some of us on the panel who might be more than happy to answer emails.
I would add to that I think allow your personal story or your personal interest to drive a lot of what you do. So I think, you might have heard something today where you're like, oh, I can see that in my own community, or I can see something totally different. And I think, writing your story and thinking about problems that you're deeply passionate about, or you have personal experience with, like I just find that that's for me always like gotten the best work out of me, not something where I'm like, oh, I have to just read this. And then I would say on the other side of that is, sometimes when we're at the intersection of these fields, it can feel like, well, I'll just like say what I think is right, but it's not necessarily what you think is right. Like this is like card-carrying science, right? So get the credentials, go find the experts. For me, when I came out and said I want to do decision making and health equity work in neurosurgery, there were really not a lot of decision-making health equity people in neurosurgery, maybe there were none. But the people that did exist were like behavioral economists at the Health Policy Center, people that had been doing work like this for years in oncology. And so then you would go to them and say like, hey, look at this problem that we have in the ER. And they're like, oh, this is so interesting. Like, how could we apply this science to it? So I think still seek out the experts. It may look like having a collaborator who's a lawyer and a, ethicist, and it may look totally different, but I think that's really important.
Yeah, I'd love to sort of even expand upon what you were saying, which is, I think, what both of you were saying is profound and important. Transdisciplinarity. We're in an era where, and this is where I think your work, Francis, and convening all of us and all the work that all of you do is so important. Very often the most vexing problems are the most complex. And despite the fact that people these days always want to sort of oversimplify, in order to address complexity, we have to understand it, and we need to study it, and we need to study it rigorously, and there are methods for doing that, and there are ways to improve methods. I want to amplify one of these points. When I knew I wanted to do both neurology and psychiatry, or I wanted the in-between, but there was no training pathway for me to do that, and I had to convince my chairman at that time and training directors to let me piece together something. And you see examples of that with all of us. And just because something doesn't exist in the world yet doesn't mean that you can't do it. And especially with my Harvard students, when I mentor them, I'm a big believer in charting your own path and not necessarily preparing yourself for just some job description that already exists, but sort of writing your own job description, if we're lucky enough to try to do that, and making the case for it, and convincing people and getting them excited and getting the training. And very often, like this anthropology student who I mentioned, I'm co-mentoring with her anthropology professor. There's another student I'm working with who was in my class last year, and we're writing a paper on the neuropsychiatry of authoritarianism. And I'm one mentor for him, and his government professor is the other mentor. And so you can put together mentoring teams, but as was just said, you have to approach us and just pop us an email, or we can direct you. Oh, there's the person in this department who's the maven, for this particular thing, or it's applicable. They've studied it in this, but you can use those methods to study that. And so, being open-minded and taking risks, I think, even though like society tells you and the economy tells you, that you can. But I think if we're lucky enough to be in a university like this or a setting like this, at least give it a try.
And I have to give a plug to the course that I teach, and have taught with Francis as well. We teach law and neuroscience, and I describe the course as an ampersand course. It's law and memory, law and trauma, law and all the other sort of neuroscientific and social psychological issues that bear on law. And I got into it because periodically, both as a judge and then as a lawyer before that, there would be some rule that I was obliged to apply, and I would say, this makes no sense. And the makes no sense led me to look at, the social psychological and psychological studies about memory. Gee, it made no sense that we were relying on eyewitness identification in the way that we did. It made no sense that we had no context for trauma. And so if you find yourself studying X and it makes no sense, find someone who will broaden this discussion. I started in graduate school in political science, was largely thought I was going to go into sociology of law, so I've been in this complicated space all along. But I think I want to second what everyone is saying, which is you're told to be linear. Life is not linear. Thinking is not linear, and your study should not be linear.
Yeah, I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and here I am, talking about this. It's all philosophy, right? So yeah.
I want to thank our panelists. I want to plug one last thing very specifically, which is this was made possible by the several organizations I mentioned. If you're local, those are all places you should go to. They're right here. brain.harvard.edu, Harvard Brain Initiative, the Neurotech Justice Accelerator. We have a huge event for trainees in June. That's neurotechjustice.org. And the Petrie-Flom Center, of which you're in the law school. So those are concrete places to go if you're local. We'll be here afterwards. There are tons of mentors around. Please join me in thanking all of those groups, especially our panelists, for being here.